Right, so Italy's government thought it could play both sides. Send a couple of warships to shadow a flotilla, look serious for the cameras, give hope to the world that this time things would be different, but still keep Israel sweet behind closed doors. A neat little trick until the moment Israel did what Israel always does: stormed civilian aid boats in broad daylight and in flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. What did Rome's warships do in the end? Well, they just watched, didn't they? They logged the crime scene. They let international law go up in smoke. That's not protection, that's betrayal. But betrayal has consequences. Because while Giorgia Meloni mocked dock workers and their proposed strike action beginning today as a long weekend break, those same dockers will shut down her ports, will send Israeli ships fleeing, and now turn Gaza's struggle into Italy's revolt. If the Navy folded, the unions aren't going to. And that's why Italy, of all places, given what we've witnessed them allow to happen, has just become Israel's worst nightmare. Right, so there is a kind of defeat that people accept. Defeat in the face of overwhelming force, where you can say you fought and you lost, where history at least records that you stood your ground. If you stand up and fight, you might lose. If you don't stand up and fight, you will always lose. But betrayal is different. Betrayal cuts deeper than any defeat because it is not forced on you. It is chosen. It is not the work of an enemy overpowering you. It's the work of an ally abandoning you. And that is what has happened to the Global Summit Flotilla, that fleet of activists, aid workers, unionists and ordinary citizens carrying food and medicine for Gaza, struck by Israel while under the supposed shadow of Italian and Spanish warships. And in the decisive moment, those warships did nothing. They just sat there and watched. They logged radar data. They might have transmitted cables back to their capitals, but they did not protect. The flotilla was no secret operation. It was a moral spectacle, and deliberately so. Its mission was transparent, to challenge Israel's story that the blockade of Gaza was impenetrable. For years, Israel had told the world that its siege was airtight, that it alone held the keys to the cage, that nothing could reach Gaza without their permission. And then came this fleet. Flour and medicine in its holds, lawyers, doctors, unionists, students, clergy, activists on its decks. And for the first time, European warships were in attendance. So the symbolism was extraordinary. NATO standard navies moving in step with civilian activists towards besieged Gaza. To many, it looked like Israel's impunity had finally met its limit. Yet sadly, we were set to be disappointed, weren't we? As the flotilla entered international waters near Gaza, Israel acted exactly as it has always done so before. The drones circled overhead. The commandos began boarding the vessels. Activists were subjected to an act of piracy in international waters, handcuffed and dragged away. The cargo was seized, the civilian vessels towed into captivity. An illegal act playing out again in front of the world. And those European warships that had shadowed the flotilla, they just sat there like lemons. Most ships never crossed into the zone Israel claimed as its maritime blockade, though of course the blockade was breached by the McKenna and the MV Rachel Corrie, demonstrating that against the odds the flotilla still broke the siege. But these warships never challenged the assault. They never defended international law. They never once stood between attackers and those being attacked. And that is not neutrality. That is not caution. That is not actually defeat. That's betrayal. Spain had set its position before the flotilla sailed. Its naval vessel was restricted to rescue-only duties, a bureaucratic euphemism meaning it would scoop survivors from the water after Israel attacked, but it would never prevent the attack itself. Italy had taken another route, pressuring activists to offload their cargo in Cyprus and avoid confrontation altogether. In other words, accept Israel's veto over Gaza's lifeline and walk away. So these were not escorts in any real sense at all. They were props, deployed for the sake of optics, for a good headline for those countries' leaders, not protection. And when the test came, they chose to let Israel break the law, as they always get away with doing. Lawyers Without Borders have put the matter a bit more plainly. In a statement, they said Spain had refused the protection necessary to complete a humanitarian mission, and by omission had become complicit in the attack that followed. Italy, they went on, had gone further still, violating international law outright and shifting responsibility for Israel's crimes onto the very victims of those crimes. And that phrase carries the weight of centuries of injustice, shifting responsibility onto the victims. It's the oldest trick in the Book of Power. Blame the starving for their starvation. Blame the beaten for standing where they were beaten. Blame the besieged for daring to resist their siege. But betrayal can spark revolt, and this is where Italy's story changes. Because while Giorgia Meloni's government played the coward, Italy's dock workers rose to the moment. Long before the flotilla sailed, unions had warned if Israel lays a hand on these ships, not another nail will leave Italian ports bound for Tel Aviv. That was not an idle threat, it was a promise, rooted in the muscle memory of decades of worker militancy. And with the flotilla having been struck, they now make good on their word. In the days after Israel intercepted the flotilla, Italy entered a different phase of resistance. In Livorno, port workers refused to service Israeli-linked vessels, forcing them to depart without unloading or loading. Across the country, union pronouncements confirmed that docks in Genoa and elsewhere are under pressure. Workers coordinating refusals to facilitate any cargo suspected of heading Israel's way. In Genoa, authorities report thousands of demonstrators gathering at key port entrances, reinforcing the resolve to shut down Israel-bound logistics. These are not symbolic acts. They're real disruptions. The infrastructure of trade is being contested, cargo delayed or rerouted, and the normal flow of commerce intervened in by those refusing complicity. This is how solidarity becomes material, not in hashtags, not in press releases, but in the refusal of workers to move goods, to touch cargo, to let the machinery of commerce grind on as though nothing had happened. The dockers said they would block everything, and they seemingly plan on doing just that. And it didn't stop there either. The spirit leapt from the ports to the nation. The USB union declared a nationwide strike beginning today, explicitly in response to Israel's assault on the flotilla. CGIL, the largest union in the country, backed it despite threats from government authorities that the action was unlawful. People choosing to withdraw their own labour, that can never be unlawful. Last time I looked, that was still a human right. Trains have been halted, buses have vanished from streets, schools have shut their doors, factories have downed tools, public administration has ground to a crawl. In Turin, protesters have seized train stations and clashed with riot police. Across Rome and Milan, Naples, Bologna, Florence, piazzas filled with demonstrators waving Palestinian flags and chanting against their own government's betrayal. A foreign policy decision to shadow and then abandon a flotilla has spilled directly into domestic life. Ordinary Italians who may never have seen Gaza or read international law now felt the siege in their commute, in their schools, in their shops. Gaza's struggle has crossed the Med, not in the form of missiles, but in the form of strikes and blockades. So what of the Italian government here? What of Giorgia Meloni? How did she respond to all of this? With contempt, with sarcasm, with absolute disdain and disgust for her own people. At a European Union summit in Copenhagen, she sneered that the strike was nothing more than a long weekend break. She scoffed that revolution and long weekends don't go together. She insisted solidarity with Gaza brought no benefit to Palestinians and only inconvenienced Italians. But by admitting the strike caused inconvenience, she admitted its effectiveness. By sneering at revolution, she revealed her dread that revolt might spread. And in a country like Italy, with its long memory of workers' uprisings, of student revolts, of anti-fascist resistance, mocking strikes as holidays is not just tone deaf, it's dangerous. Italians have brought down governments before. They may yet do it again if she carries on like this. Meanwhile, union leaders were already casting their gaze beyond Italy. They declared that Rome's betrayal had made Italy the epicentre of a wider European revolt. Dockers in Marseille pledged to block Israeli-linked vessels. Workers in Barcelona, Antwerp, Rotterdam prepared similar actions. What began as a national strike was suddenly the seed of an international blockade. This was the spirit of the anti-apartheid boycotts reborn, when dockers in Europe and America refused to touch South African cargo. But now the target is Israel, yet the weapon is the same: industrial refusal. So what could Italy and Spain have done differently to avoid all of this? Well, they could have guaranteed the flotilla's safe passage, even at the risk of confrontation. They could have dared Israel to attack NATO standard navies rather than civilian activists. They could have filed urgent complaints at the UN, dragged Israel before the International Court of Justice, forced its blockade into legal scrutiny, just as South Africa have done. They could have placed MPs and journalists on those flotilla ships, their own people, making them politically untouchable. They could have declared in advance that piracy, as we've already seen Israel enact against flotillas, would mean sanctions if enacted here. Above all, they could have listened to their own citizens rather than mocking them. But by doing none of this, they collapsed. They revealed that European governments are paper shields, willing to shadow but not to protect, willing to promise but not to act. They left the defence of law and humanity to dockworkers and trade unions, and in doing so they exposed the truth, that states are aligned with Israel, but people are aligned with Palestine. So has Italy crossed into open revolt? In the sense that matters, yes. Revolt is not only barricades and rifles, revolt is the refusal of the governed to consent to betrayal. Revolt is dockers blockading trade, unions paralysing transport, students seizing stations, lawyers naming crimes, citizens filling piazzas and waving flags. Revolt is when rulers sneer and people answer with action. Italy is living that revolt now and this weekend, and Israel should pay attention because this revolt spreads. Marseille dockers are already blocking. Barcelona and Antwerp are preparing. If ports across Europe begin to close to Israeli trade, Tel Aviv faces a crisis it cannot bomb its way out of. You cannot send commandos against dockers in Genoa or Antwerp. You cannot drone strike union halls in Marseille. You cannot blockade your own blockade. Meanwhile, Gaza still starves. Israel still bombs hospitals, still blocks aid convoys, still kidnaps activists at sea. Iran has demanded the UN Human Rights Council punish Israel for genocide, yet we're all told Iran are the bad guys all the time, aren't we? Human rights bodies insist that starvation as a weapon is a crime, and they're right. And yet Western governments do nothing. They drag their feet, they talk, they wring their hands, and into that void step the dockers, step the trade unions, step ordinary working class people. They are doing the work that states will not. That's the meaning of this moment. It is proof that when governments betray, people can revolt. That when states stand aside, workers can act. That when Israel counts on impunity, it can be challenged not in courts or councils, but in ports and streets. So perhaps history will remember this moment not for the warships that watched and did nothing, but for the dockers who blocked and did everything. Perhaps it'll be remembered with Italy as the place where Gaza struggle across the sea, not in speeches but in strikes. Perhaps it will remember Giorgia Meloni's sneer about long weekends as the moment she lost it all. Perhaps it will remember that betrayal once exposed can ignite revolt fiercer than any defeat can. Italy's ports turned on Israel had Tel Aviv in a flap before. Now they need to own the fact that arms not getting through might be the least of their problems if Italy refused to allow any goods through to them now. Not one more nail even. Check out all the detail of that story. This video recommendation here is your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.